Tonight, we're traveling to Japan. The year is somewhere in the early 13th century. In the hills above the city of Kyoto, where the cedar forests grow thick and the mornings come slowly through layers of mist, there is a monastery. It sits on the side of a mountain, not at the top, where the wind is too strong and the ground too rocky, not at the bottom, where the roads are and the noise of the city still reaches. Somewhere in between, on a long, flat shelf of land cut into the hillside surrounded on 3 sides by forest, and on the 4th by a view that drops away through trees to the valley far below. The monastery is called Enshoji. It has been here for 40 years. Long enough for the stone pathways between the buildings to have settled into the earth, long enough for moss to have grown thick on the northern walls, and the roots of the cedar trees to have pushed up through the edges of the courtyard. It is before dawn. The air is cold and still. Inside the main building, in a long, low room that faces east toward the valley, a lamp is burning. The room is the writing room. The monks call it the ink room because of the smell that lives there, the deep mineral smell of ink that has soaked into the wooden walls and floors over many decades of the same work being done in the same place. At a low desk near the window, a monk is seated. His name is Brother Ryoshi. He is in his middle years, calm-faced, with hands that are slightly ink-stained at the fingertips in a way that no amount of washing entirely removes. He has been a scribe for most of his adult life. He has sat at desks like this one, in rooms like this one, doing this work for longer than he sometimes remembers. He is at work already, grinding ink on the stone. The sound is soft and circular, and very quiet. Brother Ryoshi had been awake since the bell. The bell at Enshoji was a large bronze one, hanging in a small open tower at the edge of the courtyard. It was struck each morning before dawn with a wooden mallet wrapped in rope. The sound it made was not sharp or startling. It was deep and round, expanding outward in all directions before slowly dissolving into the air. He had been a monk long enough that the bell no longer woke him so much as confirmed he was already awake. He rose from his sleeping mat in the small room he shared with one other monk, a younger man named Brother Seijo, who slept with the absolute stillness of someone with a clear conscience. Ryoshi dressed in the dark. His robe was a gray-brown color, thick cotton, worn soft over many years of washing. He folded the outer layer across his chest and tied his belt with the same 2 movements he made every morning. He put on his sandals. He went to the morning service. The meditation hall was dim and smelled of incense. The monks filed in silently and took their places in 2 long rows facing each other across the narrow room. They sat in the formal posture, legs crossed, back straight, hands resting in the particular arrangement that had been shown to each of them when they first arrived. The head monk struck the wooden block 3 times. Silence. The morning sitting lasted the length of time it took a stick of incense to burn. Ryoshi sat with his eyes lowered and his breathing slow. His mind moved through its usual morning patterns, thoughts arriving and passing the way clouds pass without being held. This had come with years. In his early time at the monastery, the sittings had been harder, his mind more resistant. Now it settled more easily, not perfectly, but more easily. When the incense had burned down, the block was struck again. The monks rose, bowed, and filed out into the courtyard. The courtyard in the early morning was cold and quiet. The mist that had settled in the valley overnight was still below them, a white layer filling the lower ground. The sky above was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, pale gray becoming pale gold above the far line of hills. Ryoshi stood for a moment before going to wash. He looked at the mist in the valley and the sky above it, and the dark shapes of the cedar trees on the hillside. Then he went inside. He washed his face and hands at the stone basin in the washroom. The water was cold in the way that mountain water in autumn is cold, clean and sharp. He poured it from the wooden ladle and let it run over his hands and face and dried himself on the folded cloth beside the basin. He looked at his hands briefly, the ink stains at the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand, the middle finger most of all, where the brush rested when he worked. It was simply part of his hands now, the way calluses are part of a farmer's hands. He went to the kitchen building for the morning meal. The kitchen was the warmest room in the monastery. The fire under the large iron cooking pot was kept going from before dawn until after the evening meal, and the stone walls had absorbed years of that warmth and gave it back steadily. The morning meal was simple: rice porridge called okayu, cooked until very soft and thick, served in a wooden bowl, a small dish of pickled vegetables alongside, a cup of hot water with a little salt. Ryoshi sat on the low bench with the other monks and ate without speaking. The rule of silence during meals was observed at Enshoji, at least in the mornings. The only sounds in the kitchen were the sounds of eating, the occasional soft setting down of a bowl, the fire under the pot, and outside the window the first birds beginning in the cedars. He ate slowly. He drank his hot water. He sat for a moment after the bowl was empty. Then he rose, bowed toward the kitchen monks who had prepared the meal, and went to the ink room. The ink room before the other scribes arrived was the quietest place in the monastery. Ryoshi opened the wooden door and stepped inside. The room ran along the east side of the main building, the windows facing the valley and the rising sun. At this hour, the light coming through the paper screens was pale and diffuse, not yet direct, but enough to see by if you positioned yourself correctly. He went to his desk. His desk was the third from the left in the front row, the position he had occupied for 11 years. The wood of the surface was very smooth and slightly dark from the oils of his hands. The small hollow at the top right corner where the inkstone sat had worn slightly deeper than the rest of the surface over the years, a shallow depression made by the weight of the stone and the circular motion of grinding. He sat down. He arranged his things. The inkstone, a flat rectangle of dark stone with a shallow well at one end. The inkstick, black and slightly fragrant, made from pine soot and hide glue pressed into a solid block. The water jar, ceramic, with a small wooden stopper. The brushes in their stand, 4 of them in different sizes, each coming to a fine point at the tip. He removed the stopper from the water jar. He poured a small amount of water into the well of the inkstone. He picked up the inkstick and began to grind. Grinding ink was the first task of every morning, and it could not be hurried. The ink stick moved in slow circles on the wet stone, the pressure firm and even. As it moved, the water in the well darkened gradually, going from clear to pale gray to a deep black. The smell rose slowly, that mineral smell, clean and slightly sharp. Ryoshi ground the ink with the same attention he gave to everything else at this desk. The circular motion, the slight resistance of the stone, the darkening water. The light through the paper screens changed slowly as he worked. What had been gray was becoming warmer. The sun was clearing the far hills. The valley below was coming out of its mist. He kept grinding until the ink was ready. Then he set the stick down, picked up his brush, and began. The text he was copying was a sutra, the Lotus Sutra, one of the most important texts in the Buddhist tradition, a long and intricate work that Ryoshi had copied 3 times in his life and was now copying a 4th. Each time was different, not the text itself, which was the same, but the experience of copying it, which changed as he changed. The first time he had been young and careful and slightly anxious, aware of every stroke, worried about errors. The second time he had been more confident, but perhaps less attentive, moving through familiar passages with a speed that produced good work, but not his best work. The third time, about 8 years ago, something had shifted. He had begun to understand what the older scribes had always said about sutra copying, that it was not simply transcription, that the movement of the brush through each character was itself a form of practice, not separate from the morning meditation, but continuous with it. This 4th time, he was trying to remain in that understanding for the full length of the work. Some days it was easier than others. He placed the brush on the paper. The first stroke. In Japanese calligraphy, each character is made of a specific number of strokes, in a specific order, with specific directions and pressures. The brush enters the paper at a certain angle, moves in a certain direction, lifts at a certain point. Done with attention, each character has a quality that goes beyond legibility. Ryoshi worked slowly down the first column of characters. The brush moved across the paper, each character sitting evenly below the last, the columns running right to left, the way Japanese text always ran. The ink was dark and clean against the pale, washy paper. The surface had a slight give to it that the brush responded to, a quality he had come to know so well over the years that he noticed it only when it changed. When a new batch of paper arrived from the valley workshop and behaved slightly differently from the last. The sound the brush made was almost nothing, just the faintest whisper as the hairs moved across the surface. He worked through the first part of the morning without stopping. Once the rhythm established itself, once the brush was moving and the ink was flowing correctly, and his attention had settled fully onto the work, stopping felt like interrupting something better, left uninterrupted. He reached the end of a column. He paused. He dipped the brush again, touched the tip lightly to the edge of the stone to remove the excess ink, and began the next column. The light through the paper screens had shifted while he worked. What had been pale and diffuse was now slightly warmer. The sun was fully over the eastern hills. the room was brighter. He did not look up. Around this time, the other scribes arrived. First, Brother Kenji, a younger monk who walked quickly and had a habit of arranging his desk materials with great precision before beginning, lining up his brushes at exact intervals, checking his ink twice before touching paper. Then Brother Doken, one of the oldest monks in the monastery, who moved slowly and settled at his desk with the air of someone returning to a place they had been sitting their whole life. Then, two younger monks still learning, who sat at the back row desks and worked on simpler copying tasks. The room filled with the quiet sounds of work, ink being ground, brushes touching paper, the soft movement of a completed sheet being set aside to dry, the occasional sound of a brush being rinsed in the water jar. Ryoshi was aware of all of this without paying particular attention to any of it. The sounds of the other scribes were simply part of the room, the way the smell of the ink was part of the room. Background. Familiar. He kept working. The sutra passage he was copying now was one he had always found difficult to move through well. Not difficult in terms of the characters themselves, which he knew. Difficult in terms of maintaining the quality of attention it deserved. It was a long section of repetition, the same phrases returning again and again in slightly different arrangements. He had learned what happened when a scribe stopped paying attention to this kind of passage. He had seen it in his own work in his earlier years. The hand grew mechanical. The characters lost something. They looked correct if you did not look closely. But if you looked closely, they were merely competent rather than present. The difference between a brush moved by a thinking hand and a brush moved by habit. He reached the beginning of this section now. He paused, brush lifted slightly from the paper. He looked at the first character of the passage. Then he looked away from it, toward the paper screen and the light beyond. He took one slow breath. Then he looked back and began. He worked through the difficult passage carefully, each character receiving the same attention as the first character of the morning. He held each stroke deliberately, watching the ink lay down, lifting the brush at the correct moment. Some of the characters were good. One column in particular came out very well. The strokes confident and clean, the spacing between characters exactly right. He noticed this when he reached the end of the column but did not pause on it for long. He dipped the brush and continued. This was the nature of the work. Good moments and less good moments, all part of the same morning, the same page, the same text. The goal was not to produce only the good moments. The goal was to keep working through all of them with the same quality of attention. Mid-morning, he stopped to check his brushes. He lifted the smallest one from its stand and drew it to a point between his lips, the way all the scribes did, then held it up toward the light from the paper screen. The tip was still good. He set it back and lifted the second brush. This one he had been watching for a few days. There was something happening at the very tip, a slight unevenness that was not yet affecting the work, but would soon. He could feel it in the strokes, a faint resistance where there should have been none, the hairs not quite following the direction of his hand the way they should. He took the small knife from the wooden box at the side of his desk and drew it slowly across the whetstone, 4 times on each side. He tested the edge against his thumb. He trimmed the brush with very small, careful cuts. He rinsed it, drew it to a point, and tested it on the scrap of paper kept at the edge of his desk. Better. He returned the knife to its box and picked up his brush again. The morning moved through its hours. The ink in the stone well needed refreshing once, and he ground more, the same slow circular motion as the morning, the same gradual darkening of the water. While he ground, he rested his eyes looking out through the paper screen at the shapes of the cedar trees on the hillside, dark vertical lines against the pale light. He ground until the ink was ready. Then he picked up his brush again. The other scribes worked around him in the same quiet way. Occasionally, one of the younger monks at the back would come forward to ask a question in a low voice, pointing at something on his paper. Ryoshi would look, say a few words, and return to his own work. These interruptions were small and passed quickly. The room had its own rhythm, and the rhythm absorbed everything. Near the end of the morning session, Ryoshi set his brush down and looked at the work he had done. 6 columns completed. The difficult repetitive passage was behind him. The characters on the page were even and clean, the columns running parallel and straight down the paper. He looked at it without strong feeling in either direction. It was good work. Not the best work he had ever done, and not the worst. It was honest work done with consistent attention, and that was what the text deserved. He covered the inkstone with its small wooden lid. He rinsed his brushes carefully in the water jar, drawing each one to a point before setting it back in the stand. He blotted the remaining water from the jar with a folded cloth. He looked once more at the completed columns. Then the bell rang for the midday service, and he rose from his desk, straightened his robe, and went out into the hallway. On some mornings, Ryoshi was asked to spend time with one of the newer monks. This particular morning, it was a young monk named Brother Shinso who had arrived at Enshoji 6 weeks earlier from a small temple further north. He was perhaps 18, thin-faced, with the careful, quiet manner of someone still learning where everything was and how everything worked. He had been assigned to the ink room to begin learning the basics of manuscript copying. Not the copying itself yet. The preparation, how to set up a desk correctly, how to care for the tools, how to grind ink. Ryoshi had done this a few times over the years. He did not find it unwelcome. Teaching had a way of clarifying things that had long since become automatic, returning his attention to the fundamentals of the work. He brought Shinso to the desk beside his own. He began with the inkstone. He set it on the desk in front of the novice and asked him to look at it. Shinso looked at it, a flat rectangle of dark stone, unremarkable to an eye that did not know what it was looking at. Ryoshi told him to pour a small amount of water into the well at one end. Not too much. Enough to cover the bottom of the well without filling it. Shinso poured carefully from the water jar. His hand was slightly unsteady. Then Ryoshi handed him the ink stick and told him to grind. Shinso began grinding. Too fast. The motion was circular but rushed, the pressure uneven, bearing down on one side of the stroke and lightening on the other. Ryoshi watched for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Slower." Shinso slowed, He said, even pressure, the same on every part of the circle, not heavier going forward, not lighter coming back. Shinso adjusted. They stayed like this for a while, Ryoshi watching, Shinso grinding, the ink in the well darkening very slowly. After a few minutes, Ryoshi told him to stop and look at the ink. Shinso looked. Ryoshi asked him what he saw. Shinso said it looked gray. Ryoshi said yes. That meant it was not ready. He told him to keep grinding until the ink was dark enough that he could not see the bottom of the well through it. When he reached that point, he should grind a little more. Shinso nodded and continued. When the ink was ready, Ryoshi handed him a brush. Not one of his own, a spare kept in the box at the side of the desk for exactly this purpose. An older brush with a still usable tip, but past its best, suitable for practice. He told Shinso to hold it. Shinso held it the way a person holds a writing tool when they have only ever held a writing tool one way, gripped firmly near the base, the handle almost horizontal, the way you might hold a knife. Ryoshi asked him to loosen his grip. Shinso loosened it slightly. More, Ryoshi said. Shinso looked uncertain but loosened further. Ryoshi told him the brush was not a tool you held against the paper. It was a tool you guided above it. The hairs did the work. The hand directed. If the grip was too tight, the hand could not feel what the brush was doing, and if the hand could not feel it, it could not respond to it. He showed Shinso how to hold the handle, resting lightly between the first two fingers and the thumb, the other fingers curled gently beneath, the handle nearly vertical. Shinso tried it. His hand looked uncomfortable. Ryoshi told him it would feel strange for some time. That was normal. The hand had to learn a new way of working, and it would resist for a while before it accepted the change. He had Shinso dip the brush and touch the tip to the edge of the stone, the same way he himself did every morning before beginning. Shinso did this carefully. Then Ryoshi placed a sheet of practice paper on the desk. Old paper previously used on one side, the back still clean. He told Shinso to draw a single vertical line slowly from the top of the paper to the bottom. Shinso drew the line. It was uneven, thick in the middle where the brush had pressed too hard, thin at the top and bottom where his confidence had wavered. The ink was slightly blobbed at the start, where he had hesitated before committing to the stroke. Ryoshi looked at it. He did not say it was bad. He said, "Draw it again." Shinso drew it again, still uneven, but slightly less so. The blob at the start was smaller, the thinning at the bottom less pronounced. Again, Ryoshi said. Shinso drew the line again. Ryoshi watched the line come down the paper and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You are thinking about the line. Try to think about the brush instead." Shinso looked at him. Ryoshi said, "The line will be what it is. The brush is what you can actually feel. Where it touches the paper, how much weight is in it. Whether it is moving at the right speed. Put your attention there." Shinso turned back to the paper and drew the line again. It was better. Not good yet, but better in a way that was different from the previous improvements, which had been improvements of trying harder. This one was an improvement of something else, something quieter, that Ryoshi recognized and did not try to name. He let the novice continue drawing lines on the practice paper. He returned to his own desk and picked up his brush and began where he had left off. The room was quiet around them both. The courtyard at midday was a different place from the courtyard before dawn. The mist in the valley had burned off completely. The sun was directly above the southern hills, and the light fell across the courtyard cleanly, showing the details of the place without shadow. The stone paths between the buildings, the moss on the northern wall of the main hall, vivid green in the direct light, the raked gravel of the small garden beside the meditation hall, its careful lines running parallel from one edge to the other. Ryoshi crossed the courtyard toward the main hall. Around him, the monastery was quietly moving. 2 monks carried bundles of firewood toward the kitchen. An older monk moved along the covered walkway beside the garden, hands folded inside his robe. From the direction of the kitchen came the sound of something being chopped, steady and rhythmic. Near the gate, a young novice was sweeping the stone path. He swept with careful, even strokes, moving slowly backward, the broom making a soft sound on the stone. He was perhaps 16. He had the slightly unsettled look that new arrivals carried in their first months. Not unhappy, just not yet fully absorbed into the rhythms of the place. Ryoshi had looked that way once. He did not remember it clearly anymore. After the midday service, there was a short rest before the afternoon work. Ryoshi walked the path that ran along the edge of the hillside behind the main buildings, following the contour of the slope through the cedar grove before curving back down toward the garden. The grove was quiet and cool. The sunlight came through in thin columns between the tall, straight trunks. The ground was soft underfoot, years of fallen needles compressed into a deep, springy layer that absorbed the sound of footsteps almost entirely. The smell of cedar was clean and slightly sharp, very different from the smell of the ink room. He walked slowly, hands folded inside his robe. Through the trees, the valley lay below him, pale and quiet. The road toward Kyoto just visible in the distance. He did not think about very much while he walked. This was something he had learned to do over the years, or perhaps learned to stop doing, which was to fill every available moment with thought. Walking could simply be walking. The path could simply be the path. The cedars could simply be the cedars. He walked to where the path curved back and then followed it down to the garden. The garden was a small enclosed space on the south side of the meditation hall. It was not a garden in the way a kitchen garden is a garden, full of growing things and practical purpose. It was a garden of raked gravel and a few carefully placed stones, with a single small pine tree at one corner that had been shaped over many years into a low horizontal form, its branches trained outward rather than upward. An older monk named Brother Doshu was raking the gravel. He moved very slowly along one edge of the garden, drawing the wooden rake through the gravel in long, straight lines. He was perhaps the oldest monk in the monastery, his face deeply lined, his movements deliberate in the way that very old people's movements are deliberate, with great economy and no wasted effort. Ryoshi stood at the edge of the garden and watched him for a moment. The lines in the gravel ran perfectly parallel, each one the same distance from the next. Where Doshu had already raked the surface was smooth and even. Where he had not yet raked the surface still showed the disturbances of the previous day, small marks and irregularities left by wind and the movement of feet near the edges. Doshu reached the end of a line, turned, and began the next one. He did not look up. Ryoshi watched for a moment longer and then went inside for the midday meal. The midday meal was taken in the refectory, a long, low room with wooden benches on both sides of a central table. It was the largest meal of the day. Miso soup, thick with tofu and wakame, steamed rice in wooden bowls, a dish of simmered vegetables, burdock root, and daikon cooked until soft in a thin broth, pickled plum on the side, small and very sour. The monks ate in silence as always, but the silence of the midday meal was slightly different from the silence of the morning meal. Softer somehow. The room was warm from the kitchen fires nearby. The food was warm. Outside the narrow windows, the day was at its brightest, and the light came in at a low angle across the table. Ryoshi ate slowly and carefully. He had eaten this meal, or one very like it, every day for many years. He did not eat it without attention. One of the things the monastery had taught him or tried to teach him was that attention was not something to be reserved for important moments. It applied equally to a bowl of miso soup and to a page of sutra text. He was better at this in some moments than others. He ate his rice, he drank his soup. He sat for a moment after the bowls were empty, listening to the sounds of the room around him. Then he rose and went back to the ink room for the afternoon. The afternoon light was different from the morning light. It came from the south now, lower and warmer, casting longer shadows across the desk surface. Ryoshi preferred the morning light for the finest work. The afternoon light was good, but it changed more quickly, and by mid-afternoon the room was already beginning to dim on days when clouds came down from the mountains. He sat down at his desk. He uncovered the inkstone and checked the well. Still enough from the morning. He would not need to grind again until tomorrow. He picked up his brush and found his place in the text. He lifted the next sheet of paper from the stack beside his desk. It came from a workshop in the valley below the monastery, the same workshop that had been supplying in shoji for as long as Ryoshi had been here. He had worked with this paper for so many years that he could often tell what season it was simply from the way it felt beneath the brush. In winter it seemed slightly stiffer, the fibers tighter in the cold, dry air, the ink sitting on the surface a little sharper and drying quickly. In summer it softened in the humidity and the ink spread a little more than expected, requiring a slightly drier brush and a little more patience. Today it felt the way autumn paper felt, firm but not stiff, receptive without being too yielding. He smoothed it flat on the desk with the back of his hand and began. Partway through the afternoon, he set the brush down and picked up the ink stick. The well was running lower than he had thought. He added a small amount of water and began to grind. The stick had come from the same supplier in Kyoto that the monastery had used for many years. Ryoshi had worked with enough ink sticks over his life to know that they varied more than they should. Some ground unevenly, producing ink that was gritty or inconsistent, that skipped across the paper or spread in ways that were difficult to control. Others behaved well from the first morning to the last. This one had been dependable from the beginning. He had noticed it within the first few strokes of grinding. The way the ink darkened evenly in the well without any grittiness, the way it flowed off the brush cleanly. Small things. But after enough years at the desk, small things were what you noticed. He ground slowly until the ink was ready. He set the stick down and picked up the brush again. Later in the afternoon, he reached for the smaller of his brushes. He used the larger one for most of the text, the main body of the characters that made up the bulk of the sutra. The smaller one was for the finer work, the character components that required a more precise tip, and for the annotation marks written in the narrow spaces between columns. He had learned over the years that every brush had its own character. Some held their point session after session without any attention. Others lost it almost immediately, the hairs splaying slightly after the first rinsing, never quite returning to what they had been. He had learned to notice this quickly in the first few strokes of a new brush, before it had a chance to affect the work. The smaller brush he was reaching for now was a good one. He had been using it for perhaps 4 months. The tip was still clean and fine. The hairs followed his hand the way good brush hairs did, without resistance, without hesitation. He dipped it in the ink and continued. Across the room, Brother Dokun was working on something different from his usual copying. He was repairing a manuscript. The manuscript was an old one, its paper brittle at the edges and split in several places along the fold lines. Dokun worked on it with small tools and very thin strips of fresh washi, gluing them carefully over the damaged areas from behind with a paste made from rice and water. Ryoshi had watched him do this kind of work before. The old monk handled the damaged pages with a lightness that seemed at odds with his age, his large hands moving with great care around the fragile edges. Some of the manuscripts he repaired were very old, older than anyone currently at the monastery. Some had come from other places brought to Enshoji for safekeeping, their origins not fully known. Ryoshi thought sometimes about the scribes who had made those manuscripts, men who had sat at desks like his, grinding ink in the early morning, lifting brushes, working through difficult passages with care. None of them had known who would eventually read what they made, or how long it would last, or where it would end up. He looked at the page in front of him. Then he dipped his brush and continued. The afternoon passed in this way, one column after the next, the light slowly changing on the paper screens. The other scribes worked quietly around him. Occasionally, someone rinsed a brush or set a completed page aside to dry. Otherwise, the room was still. The afternoon session ended when the light became too poor to work by. In autumn, this happened earlier each week as the days shortened. Today, the light had begun failing around mid-afternoon when cloud came down from the mountains and covered the sun. By the time the bell rang for the end of the work period, the paper screens were dark gray, and the candles on the desks were the main source of light. The scribes covered their inkstones and rinsed their brushes. The room settled into the particular quiet that came at the end of a workday, different from the quiet of active work, a quieter quiet if that was possible. Ryoshi carried his completed pages to the drying shelf at the back of the room, a long wooden rack where finished work was laid flat to cure fully before being bound. He laid each page down carefully and looked at them for a moment in the candlelight. Good work. Not perfect, but honest and consistent and good enough that he felt no need to return to it in the morning. He left the ink room and went out into the hallway. Outside, the air had turned cold. The clouds that had come down from the mountains in the afternoon had brought with them a dampness that settled on everything. The stone paths, the wooden railings of the covered walkways, the moss on the walls, which was now very dark and wet. Ryoshi crossed the courtyard toward the bathhouse. The bathhouse was a small wooden building near the kitchen, sharing its wall with the kitchen so that the heat from the cooking fires warmed the water without additional fuel. The bath itself was a deep cedar tub, large enough for perhaps 6 monks at once, filled each afternoon and kept hot through the evening hours. He undressed in the outer room and stepped into the bath. The heat was immediate and complete. He sat down slowly, feeling the warmth move through his legs and back and shoulders, through the cold that had settled into him during the hours at the desk. The water came up to his chest. The steam rose around him. The smell was the clean smell of cedar wood and hot water. He sat without moving for a long time. His hands rested just below the surface of the water. He looked at them. The ink stains at the fingertips were still there, darker now from the day's work. The joints of his right hand were slightly stiff, the way they always were at the end of a long day. He spread his fingers slowly under the warm water and felt the stiffness ease. Outside the small high window of the bathhouse, the last of the daylight was going. After the bath, he dressed and went to the evening meal. The refectory in the evening was lit by lamps along the walls, the light lower and warmer than the midday light. The monks came in from their different parts of the monastery and took their places on the benches. There was a brief quiet before the food was brought, a stillness that settled over the room naturally. The evening meal was simpler than the midday meal. Rice and miso soup again, with a small dish of pickled vegetables. On this evening there was also a portion of simmered tofu, soft and mild, that had absorbed the flavor of the broth it had been cooked in. Ryoshi ate slowly. After long days in the ink room, he was often not very hungry at the evening meal. His body had been still all day and did not ask for much. He ate what was given out of respect for the kitchen monks who had prepared it, and because eating regularly was simply part of the structure of the day. The room was quiet around him. The lamps on the walls gave a soft, unsteady light. Shadows moved slightly on the ceiling. He drank his soup and looked at nothing in particular, and let the warmth of the food settle into him. After the evening meal, there was a short free period before the final service of the day. Some monks used this time to read. Some walked in the covered walkway around the garden, which was something that could be done in any weather, and which several of the older monks did every evening without fail. Moving slowly around the perimeter of the garden in the dim light, hands folded, their sandals making a soft sound on the stone. Ryoshi sometimes read and sometimes walked and sometimes simply sat. Tonight he sat in the small common room beside the refectory. The room had a low table and several cushions on the floor and a lamp in the corner. 2 other monks were there already, Brother Kenji writing something in a small notebook, and an older monk named Brother Genshin, who was simply sitting with his eyes half closed, his hands in his lap, not asleep, but not quite awake either. Ryoshi sat down on one of the cushions. He did not pick up anything to read. He sat with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees and looked at the lamp in the corner. The flame was still. The room was warm. Outside, he could hear the wind beginning to move through the cedar trees on the hillside, a low sound that rose and fell slowly. He sat like this for a while. His mind moved through the day without holding on to any of it. The morning meditation, the grinding of the ink, the first strokes of the brush. The difficult passage worked through carefully. The afternoon light changing on the paper screens. The bath. The meal. All of it passing through without particular weight. He noticed his right hand and stretched the fingers slowly, still slightly stiff. By morning, it would be fine. Autumn deepened through the weeks. The days shortened steadily, the light in the ink room failing earlier each afternoon, the morning darkness lasting longer each day. The mist in the valley below the monastery became thicker and more persistent, sometimes not clearing until well past midday, sometimes sitting in the valley through the entire day, while the monastery above it moved through its routines in pale, cold sunlight. The cedar trees on the hillside did not change color the way the maples further down the slope did. The cedars stayed dark green through every season, but the maples turned slowly through October, going from green to yellow to a deep red that was visible from the courtyard on clear days. A wash of color on the lower hillside that lasted perhaps 2 weeks before the leaves fell and the branches were bare. Ryoshi noticed the seasons through the windows of the ink room as much as anywhere else. The quality of the light changed. The temperature of the room changed. The paper on his desk behaved differently. The ink dried at a different pace. These were small things, noticed only through years of sitting at the same desk, through the same sequence of seasons. But they accumulated into a kind of knowledge that was hard to describe, and that he had never tried to describe to anyone. He had watched these changes from this desk for 11 years. Winter came in late November. The first snow fell overnight, and Ryoshi woke to a different quality of silence than usual. The particular silence of a world covered in snow, sound absorbed and muffled, and the air very still. He dressed and went to the morning service. The courtyard was white. The paths had already been swept by the time the monks came out after the service, the novices having risen earlier than usual for this task, but snow was still falling lightly, and the swept paths were already dusting over again. The cedar trees on the hillside above held snow on their branches, the weight of it bending the lower branches slightly downward. The ink room was very cold in the mornings through winter, cold enough that the water in the jar beside his desk would sometimes have a thin skin of ice on it when he arrived. He broke it with the handle of his knife before pouring it onto the stone. The ink itself ground slightly differently in the cold, thicker and slower to reach the right consistency, requiring more patience in the early minutes before the friction of the stone warmed things slightly. He wore an additional layer under his robe through the winter months, a padded cotton vest that one of the sewing monks had made for him several years ago. Warm without being bulky enough to restrict the movement of his arms at the desk. He worked through the cold mornings the same as any other. The Lotus Sutra was completed in early winter. Ryoshi set the final brushstroke on the final character of the final page on a gray morning in December, when snow was falling outside and the paper screens were dark with cloud. He set the brush down. He looked at the completed page. Then he looked at the full manuscript, the pages stacked in their correct order on the drying shelf, representing 4 months of work, hundreds of pages of careful, steady effort. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel. Not elation or relief or pride, something quieter than any of those, a kind of settling. The work was done. It had been done as well as he could do it. It would go to the library and be stored in its box on the shelves, and it would be used in the chapel services, and it would last, if it was cared for properly, for a very long time. He covered his inkstone. He rinsed his brushes. He went to tell the head monk that the work was finished. A new manuscript was assigned to him the following week, a collection of Buddhist teachings, shorter individual sections but more complex in their decorative requirements, with elaborate illuminated headings at the start of each section that would require a different kind of attention from the main text copying. He began preparing for it the way he always prepared for a new manuscript, reading through the original text to understand its structure, checking his paper supply, looking at his brushes and considering which ones were in good enough condition for the work ahead and which needed attention before he began. He had learned early that beginning a new manuscript without this preparation produced inferior work. The work always showed whether or not you had been ready for it. Winter passed and spring came slowly up the mountain. The snow on the hillside retreated upward week by week, the bare earth appearing below it dark and wet. The maples on the lower slope put out small pale leaves. The moss on the monastery walls turned a brighter green. The mist in the valley below thinned, and the valley itself became visible again in the mornings, after months of being hidden. The days lengthened and the light in the ink room came back. Ryoshi noticed this each spring as something almost physical. The paper screens brightening earlier in the morning, the room warming by mid-morning rather than staying cold until midday, the ink drying more quickly in the drier air, which meant he could move through columns a little faster without risking smearing the work. Small adjustments, familiar ones. He had made them every spring for 11 years. New monks arrived at the monastery from time to time. Some stayed for years and became part of the permanent life of the place. Others stayed for a season or two and moved on, going to other monasteries or returning to lives outside the walls. The scribes changed slowly over the years. Brother Doken, the oldest of them, died in the winter that Ryoshi was copying his second manuscript. He had died quietly, in his sleep. His desk had been empty for several weeks before a new scribe was assigned to it. Ryoshi had looked at the empty desk sometimes during those weeks. Not with grief exactly, something more like recognition. The desk had been there before Doken, and it was there after him. The work done there still existed in the library. The desk itself carried the marks of his years at it. The smooth, worn surface, the slight darkening of the wood at the left edge where his arm had rested. The new scribe who eventually took the desk was a young monk from the south, quiet and serious, with very neat handwriting and a habit of sitting very straight. Ryoshi had looked that way once. Summer brought its own changes to the ink room. The days were long and the light lasted well into the evening. The air was warm and sometimes humid, and on humid days the paper softened and the ink needed more time to dry, and the brush required slightly more care to keep from spreading too much. He adjusted for these things without thinking about them. The insects were more present in summer. Small moths were sometimes drawn to the lamps in the evening. Occasionally, something found its way onto a sheet of drying work and left a mark that needed careful attention to correct. He kept a thin wooden cover over his completed pages in summer. A small thing learned from experience years ago after losing a page he had spent most of a morning on. The garden was at its fullest in summer. The moss deep and green, the single pine tree in the corner casting a low shadow across the gravel. He thought about this sometimes when he passed it. Then he went inside and sat down at his desk and picked up his brush. The day wound down the way all days at Enshoji wound down. Slowly and without announcement, the light leaving the paper screens gradually until the room existed entirely by lamplight again, the same as it had when Ryoshi arrived before dawn. The scribes finished their work and prepared their desks for the following morning. Inkstones covered, brushes rinsed and pointed and standing in their stands. Completed pages carried to the drying shelf and laid flat. The water jars emptied and turned upside down so nothing could fall into them overnight. These small preparations were done quietly and without hurry. Ryoshi moved through them the same way he moved through all the tasks at his desk, with steady, unhurried attention. He checked the inkstone cover was properly seated. He looked at his brushes once more in the lamplight. He straightened the edge of the paper stack on his desk. He looked at the work, drying on the shelf. Tomorrow he would continue from where he had stopped today. The thought was neither pleasant nor unpleasant. It was simply the next thing, the same as yesterday's next thing and the day before's. He left the ink room and pulled the wooden door closed behind him. The corridor was dim, the lamps along the walls turned low for the evening. His sandals made a soft sound on the wooden floor. The smell of the corridor was different from the ink room, cooler, with a faint smell of incense carried from the direction of the chapel. He went to the final service of the day. The meditation hall was lit by a single lamp near the front of the room. The monks filed in and took their places in the 2 rows. The head monk struck the wooden block, and the room became still. The evening sitting was shorter than the morning one. Ryoshi sat with his hands in his lap and his breathing slow. The day moved through him without holding, the way the day's work had moved through him in the common room earlier. The morning grinding of the ink, the first brush strokes, the afternoon light on the paper screens, the bath, the meal, all of it settling. The block was struck again and the sitting ended. He walked back to the dormitory through the covered walkway. Outside, beyond the walkway's low railing, the courtyard was dark. The sky above it was clear, the clouds of the afternoon having moved on, and the stars were visible, sharp and numerous above the black shapes of the cedar trees on the hillside. He stopped for a moment, The air was cold and very still. The monastery was quiet around him, the sound of the day entirely gone now, replaced by the sounds of the night. The wind very low in the cedars. Somewhere below the hillside and the valley, a faint sound of water moving. He stood and looked at the stars for a moment. Then he went inside. The dormitory was dark and warm. Brother Seijo was already asleep on his mat, the same absolute stillness as every night. Ryoshi undressed quietly and lay down on his sleeping mat. He pulled the covers over him. The mat was firm beneath him, and the covers were heavy and warm. The room smelled of cotton and cedar, and the faint mineral trace of ink that followed him everywhere. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was dark. He could not see it clearly, just a sense of it above him, the low wooden beams. He lay still. His right hand rested at his side, the fingers slightly curved the way they curved around the brush handle. He was not aware of this. His breathing slowed without any effort. Outside the dormitory window, the night continued. The wind moved through the cedars on the hillside above, a low and even sound that had been there all day beneath everything else, and was now, in the quiet of the late evening, the clearest sound there was. The stars moved slowly above the monastery. The moss on the northern wall held the night dampness in the dark. In the ink room, the completed pages lay on the drying shelf, the ink set and still, the characters sitting on the paper in their even columns. In the library, the older manuscripts rested in their boxes on their shelves, as they had rested through many nights before this one. The bell tower stood at the edge of the courtyard. The bell would ring again before dawn, and the day would begin again as it always began, with cold water and the smell of incense in the walk across the dark courtyard, and the inkstone in the water jar, and the first slow, careful strokes of the morning. But that was still hours away, for now the monastery was simply quiet. The wind in the cedars, the stars above the courtyard, the night holding everything gently in the dark.